they got the 3 points. Maybe it wasn't the absolute best performance from them, but is there enough there for them to be hopeful going into this season?
I think it's too early to tell right now. I think what you would say is that you need to, first of all, deal with the situation in regards to Enzo Fernandez, because, number one, he's part of your leadership group. He's meant to be seen as one of the captains, one of the leaders in that changing room, and he's been very open about the communication and the talks and the Man City leaving these deadlines, and most importantly, as to where his future lies. I mean, he's still under a long-term contract. We know how Chelsea work in terms of their sugar night contracts. And at this stage, you really want to understand whether or not the relationship is going to be between Xabi Alonso and Enzo Fernandez, or it's going to be Enzo Maresco and Enzo Fernandez. And I feel like at this stage, Chelsea really need to digest as to what their first 11 is. I feel like we've been asking the question for the last 15 months as to who was their Chelsea starting 11. I think now we can understand in terms of in the final third, they have a clear distinction as to who they want to be leading their line. João Pedro is one that obviously is now definitively the number 9. Of course, signed a contract extension this week as well. We can see now Cole Palmer and Morgan Rogers, who have been wanting to play together for a long period of time, dating back to the Man City Academy days. And now they get an opportunity to do it in a first team at a big club, now based in London as well, with a lot of eyes around them and a lot of attention. So I think Chelsea now have enough building blocks, but there's still major question marks, because I've called them the conveyor belt in terms of for a long period of time, because they have this model of bringing these young players in, wanting to see how they develop, giving them 2 years to kind of establish themselves. And if it hasn't worked, pushing them out. If it has worked, keeping them in the first team. That doesn't lead to, in terms of consistency, it doesn't lead to continuity. You now have a manager who wants to build a project, who wants to build this team out for full-heartedly. And I really do feel like every time we bring up a graphic around Chelsea summer businesses, it's always filled to the brim. And look at it again, filled to the brim. But what I would say is there's a couple of names that haven't actually made the graphic. Jordan Henderson being one who's going to add some experience, some stability behind the scenes. Danny Welbeck might not have come with the sexy price tag, might not have even come with the big name, but will add some experience and maybe a cooler head behind the scenes. And we can talk about all of these young players that they keep bringing in because it's part of their system and part of the club's philosophy. And even some of the players that have left, like Cucurella, of course, Chalobah as well being another one. Tyreek George will be a disappointing one and never quite worked out. But there is enough stability there for Xabi Alonso to feel like there's something I can build upon. I do think that we kind of forget around Chelsea that because of their disappointment last year, that they will have an element of consistency in terms of able to plan. They'll have 7 days most of the time to plan for the next game, to plan for the next team, which will add an element of rest, but also allow players to kind of get a rhythm, get a consistency, what we saw from Manchester United in the latter half of last year. And that could be a benefit in regards to where their standings and their finish could be overall. Yeah,
with the money that they've spent, though, in the summer, like a lot's been made about the fees. That's kind of by the by at this point. But with the arrivals, do you think that if Chelsea don't mount a serious challenge for that title, especially given that, you know, no European football, do you think Chelsea fans will be disappointed?
I think Chelsea fans have been, I mean this respectively, spoilt over the last 10 to 15 years because of the success they've had. And that means it's a good thing in terms of being spoilt, because you've seen Champions League success, you've seen domestic success, you've seen high-profile managers come. Over the last 2 decades, let's be honest, Chelsea have been the best team in London. They've been one of the most dominant forces across the world of football, and they have produced and had some of the best players in terms of in the world play under Stamford Bridge dark light. So they used to this element of success being consistently in their face. This is probably the most difficult process they've had. The chopping and changing of managers, the different philosophies, the different styles they've had to adjust to. I mean, from Enzo Maresca to Liam Rosenior to now we find ourselves with Xabi Alonso all in the space of 12 months. That's a lot of change. It's a lot to digest in one period of time. But as I've said throughout this whole piece and throughout this segment, I do look at this starting 11 and I think to myself, there's some good players here, some really good players here. Lacroix's had a great 12 months. I mean, Malo Gusto's had a really, really impressive last 2 years as well. Cole Palmer's come on leaps and bounds since deciding he wanted to leave Manchester City. João Pedro, I've had the opportunity to cover him, interview him more than a few times. I know the player that was at Watford, I know the player that I now see at Chelsea, completely 2 different people. And he's grown into becoming one of the most prominent forwards in world football. I mean, Hato is another one that I covered in the Champions League in the beginning of his career, and he still has a long way to go. Levi Colwell, the building blocks are there. Romeo Lavia came with a huge price tag, a huge reputation for a teenager. Can he establish himself? And then the question marks around Reece James has never been about his ability. It's always been around whether or not he could just remain fit. So when I said that, I know I used a caveat for a lot of those players, but at the same time, the building blocks, the consistency, if it can all gel at the right time, there really could be an element of success here for Chelsea. Yeah, if they're looking to push on, Enzo Fernandez, who we talked about, is that a player that they can, one, afford to let go, and two, would they even want to, you know, he's linked with Man City, do they want to strengthen a rival if they are going to
a push to mount a serious title challenge?
Well, Timsy, you spoke about it right there. Strengthening a rival is always going to be a question mark. That's never a good factor or a good place you want to be in, because losing a player of his quality, regardless of maybe the question marks over attitude or maybe question marks over whether or not he turns up in the big games around Enzo Fernandez, what you are going to see is someone who is respected around the world of football, has played it at the highest level, has won stuff as well, leaving a changing room and going to another changing room to enhance them. He's only going to make them better. He's never going to make them worse. You think about now, a Man City team that had a huge amount of question marks going into this weekend and was looking at Mark Guehi in the midfield. Next week could be looking at Abuadi and Enzo Fernandez in there. And that's a completely different makeshift as to what you were seeing before, production-wise, goals-wise, creativity-wise. Now you're talking about Man City improving. The elements of what you're talking about, though, is Xabi Alonso able to sell the project to Enzo Fernandez? Because I always give favour to the players and I always give a little bit of grace in saying, well, think about what he's experienced over the last 12 months. He had a manager who believed in him in the beginning, in terms of Enzo Maresca, who probably developed a great relationship with, started establishing himself in the 8 position, sometimes in the 10, really probably had his best output from a goals perspective. The disconnect then became with Liam Rosinha, who never really grasped the relationships or the respect within that changing room. And now you have a great manager who I think has not been given the opportunities that he has delivered upon in terms of Xabi Alonso. I mean, Real Madrid was maybe a step too soon, too quickly, but at the same time, I'm not naive enough to forget a team that went undefeated in the Bundesliga and really demonstrated something that was revolutionary for Leverkusen. So it depends on what version of Xabi Alonso can come out and bring the best out of Enzo Fernandez in that midfield, and whether or not he can sell the project to him to make sure that he understands that he's a stalemate here.
Yeah, I mean, does Chelsea, we know growing up with Chelsea as well, they're not a club that gives managers a lot of time. So does this Xabi Alonso project does it have to include an FA Cup or a Carabao Cup, all the whilst they're not seriously challenged for the title or winning a Premier League? Do you think that's necessary in order to buy him time, in order to really set the project in?
I think when you look at the Blue Code project, I think most recently, especially with the appointment of Liam Rosinha, and I'm talking about someone who I have a relationship with, who I'm very fond of and have the highest praise for, I think he kind of walked into a situation that was never really suited for him. So I'm always going to give credence to Liam and say you were really brave in terms of wanting to take that situation, but that was never really a recipe for success overall. Xabi Alonso is going to come with a completely different reputation. He's going to come because you're coming from Real Madrid to Chelsea. It's a completely different transition. There's nobody in that changing room that can question you, question what you've been about, because not only did you demonstrate as a player, but now you've demonstrated as a head coach. You've already also produced domestic titles. So I think it completely is a completely different trajectory to what they've experienced in, let's say, the last 2 managers who, respectively, I mean, Enzo Maresca had, of course, had success in the Championship, didn't really deliver that in terms of when we're talking about domestically for Chelsea. And then Liam Rosinha wasn't really given the time to develop what he wanted in terms of his ideals. So if Blue Coat the mirror's been held up to them. Overall, in terms of the structure, the running of the club and the direction you want to go in. If you want success, the chopping and changing of managers is not really the conducive for that. What you need to do is establish someone, allow them time to build their project, build it out. And I always say the blueprint will always be Mikel Arteta right now in the Premier League. Yeah. In one of the longest tenures in terms of a manager or a head coach position. There was rumours, and I remember the speculation quite vividly around him losing his job, the question marks about whether or not he could deliver a trophy. And now we're sitting here going into this season saying that Arsenal have the most complete squad, arguably in Europe. Now, that's a manager that's been given time, that required a lot of patience. Xabi Alonso isn't exactly the same ilk. In fact, probably at this stage, Xabi Alonso has more experience and has actually won more than Mikel Arteta did at that stage. Yeah. So if you're going to look for a recipe of success, what you need to do is give a manager time to implement who he is, give him a few windows to bring in the players that he wants to. And most importantly, then he can deliver, or then he can produce, or then you can compare his results to the contemporaries.